Man, it is an exciting day here at Bridgepoint. Today is the culmination of months and months and months of work behind the scenes because we're kicking off this brand new series called Flourish. Now, I don't know what your experience is like, but sometimes I'll get online, I see pastors, and I've done this myself. They're like, you don't want to miss Sunday. This is going to be the best Sunday ever. And it's like, oh, this series is going to change your life. And let's be honest, not every Sunday is the best Sunday ever, right? Like sometimes they're just average, and that's okay. Now, having said that, I actually do believe that this series, it's not going to be the best series of all time, but I do believe it has the power to transform the way you view life, the way that you approach your day today. I think you can walk out of here at the end of this series knowing your purpose and live every day with passion and fulfillment. And again, the reason is not because the sermons are going to be super great. Because Flourish is not just a 2-month series that we're doing, though that's part of it. It is also, if you've noticed people getting out their books and you can hear them clicking open, we've written daily devotionals for every single Monday through Friday over the course of this series, and you can track along with that. And it's also a small group curriculum that we have written, I don't know the proper terminology, but we put it together ourselves. And so you're going to hear from me every week in those videos. You're going to hear from some other people here at Bridgepoint, and we're going to take the same topic that we discussed on Sunday and just approach it from a little bit different angle, and we're going to dive in really deep. And so I believe if you do all those 3 things, you're going to see God move in powerful ways. Now listen, this is going to be like, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So don't come to me in 2 months and say, I didn't really get anything out of that series when you showed up to church twice and never opened the devotionals and didn't make it to life group. But I believe if you do all of those 3 things, that God's going to move in a pretty powerful way. And the reason is because I think a lot of people tend to approach life just kind of going day by day. And I don't mean that people don't have a plan or don't have goals, but I think for a lot of people, they're just trying to work and count down the days till the weekend. Anybody ever have one of those jobs? You walk in Monday morning, you sit at your desk, and you're like, okay, it's Monday, but Monday's close to Tuesday, which is right next to Wednesday, which is halfway to Friday. And you're like convincing yourself. Anybody ever have a job like that? Anybody have a job like that right now? No, don't raise your hand on that one. We've all been there. You know, as students, we're counting down the days, just a few more days till Labor Day, and then fall breaks right around the corner. Then we got an in-service day and Thanksgiving break, or where we're counting down the months till our next vacation. Some of you are at the point where you're just counting down the years till retirement. And there's nothing wrong with looking forward to things, but I think when we revolve our whole life around this idea that when I get to that point, then I will be able to enjoy life. Then I'll be able to do the things that God has created me for. Then all of a sudden you're just kind of floating day to day. You're on autopilot. It's like you ever driven somewhere and then you arrive at your destination, you're like, I don't even remember driving. I think that's how a lot of us end up approaching life. And the reality is, I think that God has so much more in store for us. And the reason I think that is because from the opening pages of the Bible, I know some of you who have been at Bridgepoint for a while, you're like, he's going to do the Genesis thing again, isn't he? And I'm not going to do the Genesis thing, I promise. But when you read the story of creation, there's this poetry to it, right? Like on day 1, God separates the light from the dark, and he saw it, and it was. And then on day 2, he separated the ground from the sky, and he saw it, and it was. And then you have day 3 and 4 and 5, and on day 6, he created Mexican food, and it was very, amen. And so you see this idea that the word that the Bible uses to describe God's intent for his creation is that it was good. And there's an abundance of resources and life. And it's in that environment God puts Adam and Eve because he wants them to flourish. Now, we talk about creation being good, and I don't think you have to be a scholar or theologian to look around at the world today. And there's a lot of words we could use to describe our world, but I'm pretty sure good would be pretty far down on that list. Because you turn on the TV and there's a lot of political divisiveness. I mean, heck, you just get on social media and people are yelling at each other for no reason. You see things like earthquakes or hurricanes. People are dying from hunger. You have people who have their bodies riddled with cancer or another illness. Marriages fall apart. Kids are removed from homes because of abuse. I mean, there's a lot of words to describe the world, but I don't know if good is the first one off our lips. And so what happened? How did we go from this good world with an abundance of resource where people are flourishing to the world we live in now? Now, the simple answer to that is, well, sin happened. But the more complex part is because I think a lot of us have misunderstood how the Bible talks about sin. Because I don't know if you're like me, but I grew up, and when I thought or imagined sin was always an event. It was like something that happened. It was like something that I did, like I lusted or I lied or I cheated on my taxes. Whatever it is, it's something that happened. And certainly the Bible does talk about sin in that way. But the Bible also talks about sin as being this power or force that's at work in the world to destroy God's good creation. Here's what I mean. Of course, you know the rest of that Genesis story. Adam and Eve, they decide, well, God, we've got this on our own. They go their own way, and they sin. Now, that is an event. But the very next story is the story of their sons Cain and Abel. Now, both of these men offer sacrifices to God. God accepts Abel's sacrifices, but not Cain's. And Cain, instead of addressing the issues going on in his life and with his offering, he just gets mad at Abel. He's like, well, if he wasn't around, then my sacrifice would have been accepted. Which, by the way, how often when we encounter difficulties or struggles in our life, are we quick to blame other people? Like, oh, well, you don't understand. Well, that's my boss, or man, my spouse is this way. Or we complain about our circumstances. Well, you just don't understand the company that I work with. You just don't understand what it's like. Or we defend ourselves, right? We say, well, I had these things happen to me when I was a kid, and that's just the way I am. And so we blame, complain, defend. It's the same thing that Cain was doing. And God sees this, and he knows that if Cain settles in on this bitterness, it's going to lead somewhere bad. And he says, Cain, be careful, because sin is crouching, and it's ready to devour you. Right? Sin is this power that's crouching and wants to devour Cain to get him to do things he never would have imagined doing. And so you have this power of sin that's at work in the world, and it gains its power when we sin. So it's this like cyclical relationship. The power of sin corrupts us so that we sin, so it has more power. And probably the best way that I can illustrate this is by showing you a picture of the Millennium Bridge. If you've ever seen Harry Potter, you have seen this bridge before. No, this was opened in June of 2000, so just over 23 years ago. And the engineers had done all their calculations. It was built, it was steady, it was ready to go. But they did not anticipate that on opening day, every person in London would want to walk across this bridge. And so as people began walking across, think about what it's like to walk. You start to move your body weight from side to side. And with so many people moving their body weight, all of a sudden the bridge starts to sway. Now, what happens as the bridge sways? Well, have you ever been on a cruise ship or some kind of boat and you're in choppy waters and it doesn't matter where everybody starts walking the same direction? And that's exactly what happens here. As the bridge sways, everybody starts to step into alignment with one another. And as more people start walking at the same pace, what happens to the bridge? It starts to swing out of control. Now, here's the crazy thing. The people on the bridge, they didn't notice that this was going on because they're walking in step with the people in front of them and they're walking in step with the bridge. But the people standing on the shore, they were like, this is dangerous. Like something bad is about to happen. So much so that 2 days after it opened, they had to close it down and add extra reinforcements so that that wouldn't happen again. And see, I think that's exactly the way that God looks at what happened to his creation. Like we're walking in lockstep with the people in front of us. We don't feel the bridge swaying. We just think, well, this is just the way the world is. Somebody hurts you, you hurt them back. So somebody's your enemy, you got to get after them. You want to get ahead in life? Just lie, cheat, and steal. Do whatever it takes because this is just the way the world is. But I'm wondering if we're walking along in this world and God is like those people standing on the shore and he says, man, this is a dangerous situation. This is not going to end well. It's going to end in destruction. And so God's plan is actually to save us from our sin. In fact, when Jesus talks about his mission, he says, I want to save you from your sin. I think a lot of times we hear that and we think, oh, he wants to save us from the consequences of our sin. And he does that as a byproduct of the fact that he actually wants to save us from our sin. He wants to fix the bridge, so to speak, and that means we're going to have to walk a different way from everybody else. Another illustration. How many of you have ever read the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz? Anybody? All right, a few of us. All right. Now, I'm going to spoil it, but it was written in 1900, so you've had time to read. Like, don't tell me, oh, I was picking it up from the library on the way home today, okay? Now, there's a lot of differences between the book in the movie. And doesn't everybody love the guy? You're like talking about a movie and like, well, actually in the book, but I am going to be that guy today. So in the book, there's a few differences. One of them, like Dorothy's slippers, they're not ruby in the book, they're silver. And we know at the end of the movie, she wakes up and the whole thing was a dream, which can you get lazier in writing a movie than you wake up at the end and it was a dream? I mean, come on, do better, right? But another big difference is the Emerald City. Because in the movie, the whole city's emerald and it's brilliant. But in the book, when Dorothy and her friends approach the city, there is a giant emerald wall surrounding the city. And they are told that if they're going to come inside, they have to put these glasses on or else the brilliance of the Emerald City would blind them. So they put on these glasses, they walk into the city, and everything is beautiful and green. Well, when they finally meet the wizard, he reveals that the whole thing is a sham. That actually the city is white and all the glasses were tinted green to make them think that the city was emerald. And the reality is that's the world we're living in. Sin has put these glasses, this lens over our eyes that says this is the way things are. This is just how the world is. And when Jesus saves us from our sin, he wants to take those glasses off so we can see the world the way God intended and we can live the way he intended. That's how we experience flourishing. Is this making sense so far? Now, imagine how jarring it would be if you woke up tomorrow and realized this world was completely different. There's a matrix illustration in there somewhere, but I've already done too many illustrations. So you can cover that in small group if you want to. I don't care. But we wake up and you realize, okay, now I have to learn how to live an entirely new way. Right? You have to scrap everything and you got to start from the ground up. By the way, when a religious leader comes to Jesus and he says, how do I have this life of flourishing that you keep talking about? And what does Jesus say? He says, well, you have to be born again. See, you were born into sin. You're born in lockstep with everybody else. But we have to die to that way of life and be born again in Christ so that we're walking and living a different way. So following Jesus is about being born again. Now, does that mean that everything is great and it's all going to be up and to the right? No. Because even though we might be living life without the lenses on, even though we're learning to follow the way of Jesus, the rest of the world is not. And by the way, we don't blame the rest of the world for that. But the reality is sometimes we can turn the other cheek and get hit again. And sometimes we can love our enemy and we get taken advantage of. But the goal of following Jesus, following Jesus is not hacks for life. Following Jesus is about how to learn to live in this new world that God created to live the way he intended. And the writers of the New Testament pick up on this born again theme, and they start to use illustrations about growth. And in fact, if you want to write something down for notes, you can read it later. 1 John chapter 2, John actually says, hey, I'm writing to the little kids, and here's what you need to grow. I'm writing to the young men, here's what you need to grow. I'm writing to the parents, here's what you need to grow. And he's not writing to literal children or young adults or parents. He's talking like there are some of you who spiritually have just been born again, and you're starting on this journey, and here's how you grow. Some of you are young men in this journey of faith, and here's what you need. Some of you are parents, and here's how you need to parent those who are younger in the faith. It's this whole idea of spiritual growth. And over the course of the rest of this series, we're going to be exploring 5 stages of spiritual growth. And I'm going to lay them out for you today, but I'm going to put all my cards on the table here. You're not going to open up to Second Opinions chapter 5, and it's going to say, here are the 5 stages of growth. Okay, I'm just trying to give us some terminology that we can use so that we know where we are in our spiritual growth and to know how we can continue to pursue spiritual maturity. Because I think for some people, we confuse spiritual maturity with theological degrees. I know a lot of people who went to seminary who are not very spiritually mature. I know people who know a lot of the Bible, but they don't actually follow Jesus. So we can get those confused. I want to show you what spiritual maturity actually looks like. But I also didn't just make these 5 stages up out of nowhere. I think you can find these in all throughout Scripture. And I want to show you this morning how all of these stages are evident in maybe the most famous disciple's life. We're going to look at the life of Peter and how he went through each of these stages. Now, the first time we meet Simon Peter, what we read is that Jesus had gone into town. He was preaching in the synagogue. And while he's teaching, a guy runs into the synagogue who's been possessed by a demon. He starts screaming at Jesus. Jesus casts out the demon. The guy falls on the floor. Everybody was amazed. And as someone who teaches on a regular basis, I don't know how you recover from that one. I mean, I think that's just the end of the sermon right there. I mean, can you imagine somebody runs in, starts screaming, a demon's cast out? It's like, you're not going to listen to anything I have to say after that. And so it says they're all amazed, and word about Jesus spreads around. And then we get to Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 38. And this is what we read. It says, after he, meaning Jesus, left the synagogue, he entered Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him about her. So I want you to picture this. Simon Peter. He's a good young Jewish man. He was likely at synagogue where he had heard Jesus teaching unlike anything he'd ever heard before. He had seen this demon cast out. And afterwards, he says, Jesus, will you come to my house? He's like, I saw what you just did for that demon-possessed man. Maybe you could do something for my mother-in-law. And sure enough, Jesus prays over her. She's healed. And all of a sudden, she gets up and she starts taking care of Jesus and picking up things around the house, probably what a lot of people are doing before life groups later today. And then all throughout the night, people are bringing their sick or demon-possessed friends and family to Jesus, and he's just healing them all through the night. So much so that by the time it gets to the morning, he says, I got to leave, guys. I didn't come just to sit in this one town. I've got to go tell other people about the good news. Now, the next time we meet Peter is in Luke chapter 5, and you're going to talk about this in your life groups this week, so I'm not going to dive into the whole story. But when we see Peter, he's in his boat on the shore cleaning his nets after an unsuccessful night of fishing. So let me ask you a question. At this point, has Peter decided to become a disciple of Jesus? No. At this point, has he said, I'm leaving everything behind and I'm going to follow you? No. So at this point, we would say that Peter is at the stage of being unborn. He's spiritually unborn. And by the way, people who are spiritually unborn, the word I would use to describe them is they're in captivity, right? They still have the lenses on. That doesn't mean they're bad people or immoral people. You know, Christians don't have the corner market on morality. There's some people who don't follow him who are very moral, and there are some people who claim to follow Jesus who are not so much very moral. Following Jesus isn't about morality. It's about learning how to live this new way. And so we'd say to live in captivity. And what's fascinating to me is that what Peter really needed, he needed to spend time with Jesus. I think that's what all the unborn need. They just need time with Jesus. Because there are certainly accounts in Jesus' life where somebody encounters Jesus and in a moment, everything changes. They reach out and touch him and they're healed. Jesus spits in some dirt, rubs it on their eyes. They can see. There are those moments. But my guess is that a lot of people in this room are like me and like Peter. Because Peter didn't just have one encounter with Jesus. Peter sat in the synagogue and listened to Jesus teach. He saw him cast out demons and thought, maybe Jesus can help my own family. Even his own family member experienced healing from Jesus. I'm sure Peter himself was blessed, but that didn't mean he dropped everything to follow him. See, you can show up to church every week and you can see Jesus performing miracles all around you. Jesus can even be moving in your family members and those closest to you, and that does not mean that you are following Jesus. And Peter has all these interactions with him. And it's not until Jesus climbs in the boat with Peter and they push out and Jesus says, have you ever tried throwing the net out on the other side? And Peter says, Jesus, that's not how any of this works, but I'll humor you. I'll throw the net out. And all of a sudden there's so many fish in the net, the whole thing's about to capsize. It's in that moment when Peter realized all these things were leading up to this moment right here. Jesus really is who he's claiming to be. And that's when he goes to become not a fisherman, but a fisher of men. And so at that point, he moves from the stage of being unborn. We would say that now he is a spiritual infant. Now, the word I would use to describe a spiritual infant is the ignorance. It doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means they don't know a whole lot about following Jesus. In fact, this is why in the book of Matthew, right after Jesus calls his disciples, he takes them up on a mountain. And in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, there's a collection of teachings called the Sermon on the Mount. Because Jesus has to teach them, you were living this way, but now you have to live this way. In the old way, this is how it worked, but in the way of Jesus, this is how it works. So you've heard it said, just don't murder somebody and you're good, but I'm telling you, don't harbor bitterness and anger in your heart. You heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you, don't even lust after somebody in your heart. And Jesus just goes through and he's teaching them how to do all of this stuff. He's starting at the very bottom and building them up. He even teaches them how to pray, right? He says, when you pray, pray like this. And so what spiritual infants need is they need someone to share. They need someone to share things with them. You know, I think a lot of times we're quick when somebody decides, I'm going to follow Jesus, and we're like, you know what? Read your Bible and pray, right? That's always like the go-to answer. But you know what's even better than telling someone to read the Bible and pray? Show them how to read the Bible and pray. It's like, hey, why don't you come sit down with me? I'll walk you through how I read my Bible and do my devotional time. Here, come, let me pray, and then you take a turn praying. Like, we actually teach them how to pray. We do this all the time with our actual infants, right? You don't set a baby on the floor and say, walk, and then just wait for them to do something. No, you pick them up by their hands, and you move their feet, and you're trying to get them to walk. And in the same way, we have to help other people to teach them how to walk with Jesus. Now, by the way, this is not about putting people in a box and saying, oh, well, you're ignorant about some stuff, so you must be an infant. No, we're just trying to see, hey, where are we? What steps can we take? And then how can we help other people take steps with Jesus? And so we need people to help us in our ignorance. This is, by the way, an infant is somebody who they've just decided to follow Jesus, and maybe they come to you and say, hey, my grandmother just died. Do you think that like she's going to be reincarnated and I'm going to encounter her again? And we don't like judge people or yell at them like, no, it's ridiculous. You don't say stuff like that. Because you just have to teach them, no, here's what the Bible says. So we want to help people grow from beyond their ignorance and beyond their infancy into the next stage, which is, I'm going to flash forward into Peter's life here. And I want to pick up on the back half of a story we talked about a couple weeks ago. If you were here, do you remember Jesus took his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, and he said, who do people say that I am? And he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, oh, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God. And Jesus goes, that's absolutely right, Peter. Like you got it. In fact, you're so right that this had to have been revealed to you by God. And immediately after that, Jesus goes on to say, and because of that, I'm going to have to die. And what happens next is fascinating to me. It's in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 32. He says, he spoke openly about this. So Jesus spoke openly about his need to die. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Bold move. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but humans' concerns. Now, you got to love Peter here, because he says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus is like, you're right. And because of that, I'm going to have to die. And Peter's like, Jesus, could you come over here? I'd like to have a word with you for a moment. And he said, Jesus, did you not hear what I just said? I said, you're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. That means you're going to build an army. We're going to overthrow the Roman Empire. You're going to be king. And because I'm one of your first followers, I get to serve in your cabinet. Like if you die, I don't get anything, Jesus. Like at this point, we could categorize Peter as a spiritual child, because children are kind of defined by their selfishness. Right, just in general, by the way. I have kids. I'm not bagging on kids. Kids just are pretty selfish, right? It's all about them. The same way, spiritual children. Peter says, Jesus, no. I'll follow you, Jesus, but you're supposed to give me something in return. Wait, Jesus, you're not supposed to die. You're supposed to do the things I want you to do. And how many of us will follow Jesus only to the extent that he'll do something for us? But following Jesus isn't about him blessing us. It's about him freeing us so we can live the way he intended for us to live. And what children really need is they need to be connected to family. Now, here's why this is so difficult and why I believe most people get stuck at this stage of spiritual growth. Because how many of us love to be rebuked or corrected? Like anybody just love it? You're just like, that's my spiritual gift. I love being corrected. No, none of us like that. And so what happens that's so beautiful is Jesus rebukes Peter, but he doesn't kick him out of the group. He doesn't say, how dare you, Satan, now get away from me. He doesn't say that. He still has him connected to the family. And when we are spiritual children and when we're being selfish, people are going to correct you. They're going to rebuke you. But too many times, what happens? We decide to run away from home. Oh, well, I didn't like what the pastor said this week. You know, I didn't like that. That hurt my feelings. I'm leaving. I'm going to another church. Or that person in life group said something really offensive to me. And so I'm leaving. And we find all these excuses to get away from God's family, but really the only way to grow out of it is we have to be connected to God's family. Like we need people to rebuke us. We need people to challenge us, to sharpen us. It's been said that a good friend stabs you in the chest, right? It's easy for people to stab you in the back, but a good friend's gonna tell you the stuff that you don't want to hear because they know you need to hear it. See, this is how we grow out of being a child. We need that in our lives, and we have to have the humility in order to allow people to do that. We have to be willing to grow beyond the stage of spiritual childhood. Now, I want to flash forward now to later on in Peter's life. So we're, again, big gap here. So in the meantime, what's happened? Well, Jesus died. 3 days later, he rose again. He spent 40 days with his disciples, and then he ascended to be with the Father. Now, this is kind of like kids going to college, right? Because now Jesus isn't around. You're on your own. You got to figure some things out. And so you get to the book of Acts, and the disciples are trying to figure out, okay, how do we take this Jesus movement further? How do we take everything Jesus gave us and push it forward? And in Acts chapter 3, you have Peter and John are walking into the temple to worship, to pray. And there was a guy that stood outside the temple every day. He was lame, he could not walk, and he would ask people for money or for help. And so you get this interesting story in Acts chapter 3, starting in verse 6, when Peter said, "I don't have silver or gold, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, get up and walk." Then taking him by the right hand, he raised him up. And at once his feet and ankles became strong. So he jumped up and started to walk, and he entered the temple with them, walking, leaping, and praising God. So get this, Peter and John, they're walking in the temple. They have something to do. They're on a mission. And then this guy stops them to ask for help. And Peter says, "Well, I don't have any silver or gold, but I do have this. In the name of Jesus, get up and walk." And all of a sudden, this guy who never walked his entire life is jumping, shouting, praising, and running into the temple. So Peter just performed a miracle. Who else do we know in Peter's life who did things like that regularly? That was so weak. We're at church. You know the answer is Jesus, right? Yes, Jesus. So think about this. It's so cool. When Peter first encounters Jesus, what's he doing? He's performing a miracle, right? And then all of a sudden you get to the point, Jesus is gone, and now Peter is doing the things that Jesus did. We would say that this is the stage of spiritual growth where you're a spiritual young adult. And when you're a young adult, you've moved beyond that childish selfishness. And now you're someone whose life is marked by selflessness. Just remember, Peter and John, they were going somewhere. They were on, they had something to do, and this guy interrupted them. Now, do you see interruptions as inconveniences, or do you see them as opportunities? Because what young adults need, they need more opportunities to minister to the people around them. Like when you go to the gym, when somebody comes up to talk to you, are you aggravated and just waiting for them to leave so you can continue your set? Or do you see that as an opportunity for ministry? When you're talking to your neighbor, are you just trying to wrap the conversation up so you can get inside? Or do you see that as an opportunity for ministry? When somebody walks into your office and sits down, are you just trying to shoo them out? Or do you see that as an opportunity for ministry? And I think the biggest mistake we make is we think ministry is what happens inside this building. No, ministry is what happens everywhere you go. That's what a young adult realizes, and they prioritize other people over themselves. So here's the difference between a child and a young adult. A child, they're selfish. They say, yeah, I'll serve if it's convenient for my schedule. And I'll serve it only in the areas that I want to serve it. And I'll be a part of a group, but I don't know how much I can make it. But what a young adult does is a young adult says, where's the need? Do you need people to stack chairs? Let me stack chairs. You need people to stand at the door and greet somebody? I'll do that. You need somebody back in the kids? That's what I'll do. Where's the need? Oh, you need somebody to host a life group in their home? Yeah, listen, my home's not great, but you're welcome to use my home. Like, do you see the difference there between the selfishness and the selflessness? It's closed-handed or open-handed. And we only grow to this stage when we take advantage of those opportunities for ministry. And if we do that, we will reach the final stage of spiritual growth. This is where we see Peter. The last time we see Peter is in Acts chapter 15. And one of the biggest controversies in the early Christian movement, if you were here for our Roman series, we talked about this a lot. But the early Christian movement started with primarily Jewish Christians. But now all of a sudden non-Jewish or Gentile people are starting to follow Jesus. So the big controversy is, do the Gentiles have to become Jewish? Like, do they have to get circumcised if they're going to follow Jesus? Talk about a big barrier of entry, all right? Do they have to eat kosher food? Do they have to observe all of our laws? Like, do they have to become Jewish to really follow Jesus? Because wasn't Jesus Jewish? And so there's this whole big debate, and it's kind of getting out of control. So they bring it before all of the church leaders who are stationed in Jerusalem. That's where we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 6. It says, the apostles and elders gathered to consider this matter. And there had been much debate. And then Peter stood up and said to them, brothers and sisters, you are aware that in the early days, God made a choice among you that by my mouth, the Gentiles would hear the gospel message and believe. And he goes on from there. The point I want to draw out from this passage is that when they're looking for wisdom and guidance, when they don't know what to do and they pick up the phone to call dad, who's on the other end? It's Peter. Peter's the one who's guiding this early Christian movement. He's the one they're looking to as an authority, as a father figure. He had finally reached the stage of being a spiritual parent. And here's what a spiritual parent is marked by. They're marked by intentionality. See, that's the difference between a young adult and a parent. A young adult is selfless, and as those opportunities come, they'll take advantage of that. But a spiritual parent is intentional in every moment. Like, you know, the best parents, like if you think you have great parents or the best parents you see, they're intentional. They don't just like not have a plan for how they're going to raise their kids. And in the same way, a spiritual parent in every conversation, number one, they're probably asking more questions than doing teaching. But number two, in their mind, they're thinking, okay, am I talking to a spiritual infant, spiritual child, young adult? Like, who am I talking to right now? And what can I do to help them take their next steps? Because really the mission for a spiritual parent is to multiply. They ought to be multiplying. That's what makes a parent, right? They're multiplying other people. And by the way, I mean, we could go like really in depth, and then you're a spiritual grandparent, great-grandparent. But the idea is that when you reach a certain level of spiritual maturity, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, how do I help other people do the same thing and go through the same process that I went through? Does this make sense? All right. We're going to throw it open to Q&A. I don't know if we got any text-in questions. If we did not, this is the part where you're allowed to raise your hand. You can ask any question you want to. I can't guarantee I'm going to have a great answer for it, but if anybody has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand. We'll give it a minute here. All right, we got one in the back. Amy, you're my best friend, because I forgot to point that out. Amy, what a great question. That's awesome. So she asked, are the stages fluid, or do you just go through in a linear progression? Big difference between spiritual growth and physical growth is you can grow backwards or you can grow forwards. Because I bet we can all think back to a time in our life where you're just like, really like, this is, 90s. I was on fire for Jesus, right? Like you were just really passionate and you were going all in. But maybe you're at the point now where all of a sudden you started to become a little more selfish, a little more self-centered. And kind of on the theme of stepping on toes, I've talked about this before. The two times I see this happen in people's lives is when they go to college and then when their kids go to college. Because when you go to college for the first time, you don't have anybody else telling you what to do. And you're going to kind of do whatever you want to do. And when your kids go off to college, you don't have anybody telling you what to do and where to take them. And so you're going to do whatever you want to do. And so you might have, while you had kids in the home, been a spiritual parent, but now you just want to take a little bit of time for yourself. And so all of a sudden, you don't just drop back from a parent to a young adult. You can go all the way back to the child stage and just say, no, I'm guarding my time just for me. Great question. Anybody else? Go on. You have another one? All right, there you go. Yes, but, all right, don't spoil it too much. So here, that's a great question. Julia asked, so do you meet that need to help them move to the next step? I am giving you a very big overview. So what we're going to do over the next few weeks, so next week we're going to talk about the unborn, and I'm going to give you 4 things that will help you move beyond the unborn stage. So I'm just giving you a little tidbit here this morning. There's a poll right in between me and you. I'm giving you a little tidbit this morning, so we'll dive into that a little bit more, but I'm just trying to orient everybody to the language today, if that makes sense. All right, other questions? This is the fun part. You just have to suffer through the first part so we can get to the questions. All right, is that it? All right. All right, I'm sure you will ask me in the lobby, and that will be good. There's a couple things that I hope you take away from today. The first, again, understand our heart is not to put people in boxes or to label people. That's not what this is about at all. Number one, I want you to be able to walk away at the end of this series knowing where you are and what steps you can take to grow. And so in just a minute, we're going to have communion like we do every week. There's 4 communion stations around the room. And then we have 2 prayer stations up front where you can light a candle or write a prayer request and put it in the prayer jar. So that's all going to be available to you. And when you have your time with Jesus, I just want you to ask him, which stage do you think I'm at currently, Jesus? Like, would you just reveal that to me? And we'll have this up on the screen so you can see these are the things that are kind of marked by them. And this is important because we really have to be honest. Now, this is not trade and grade. You don't have to come tell me which one you're at. But in order for you to grow, you have to be honest, not where you used to be, not where you want to be, but where are you right now? And once you know where you are, it's like that. You guys ever go to the outlets and I have to look at the directory every time? I'm like, okay, I need to see I am here, and here's the place I'm trying to get to. That's all we're doing. I am here, and here's the steps to get to spiritual maturity. That's number one. But number two, my hope at the end of this series is not only will you be able to identify where you are, but you would start to be able to identify where some other people are. Again, not to put them in a box so that you can actually help them take next steps. Because here's the thing, you don't have to wait to be a spiritual parent to help somebody grow. If you're a child and you know somebody who's unborn, you can get them to infancy. Or if you know someone who's an infant, you can bring them up to where you are. God's not asking you to do anything other than where has he brought you and who can you bring along at the same time. And by the way, thinking this way will change the way you relate to people, I promise. Because, sometimes we'll have people who be like, I don't know, I'm not really getting fed from Matt. Well, you might be a spiritual child, right? Because spiritual childs still need their parent to feed them. But if you're 40 years old and you still need your dad to cut your steak for you, we went wrong somewhere. In the same way, listen, I hope that you come on Sunday mornings and I hope that you take something away. But listen, for some of you who are young adults and parents, not only are you feeding yourselves, you got to be feeding the infants. You got to be help feeding the children. And then also, you don't get offended too when somebody spouts off and says something ugly to you because you're like, that's fine. I know they're just a spiritual infant, right? Like when my kids say something mean to me, I don't go in my room and cry because I'm like, you're a kid. You say things. How many times have my kids told me they hate me, right? And I'm like, I know you love me. I'm not. So when other people are saying other things, they're just infants. It's okay. We don't have to get caught up in bitterness. It's such a great framework for us to see our growth, to help other people. I'm so excited for what's going to happen over the next 6 weeks. Our devotions start tomorrow morning. But in this moment, I'm going to pray. I'm going to dismiss us for communion and prayer. I just want you to ask Jesus, where do you think I am, Jesus? And what step do I need to take this week? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're just so thankful. We're thankful that when we were stuck on the bridge, you saved us. We approached life through the lens of sin. You opened our eyes. You rescued us not just from the consequence of our sin, but sin itself. And I'm praying right now for each and every person here who's at that unborn stage. And I'm thankful that they're here. And I pray you would continue to meet with them just like you met with Peter. And I pray for every infant who's just soaking everything in, that you would begin to send people to share with them. I pray for every child that you would provide the opportunities and the outlets and the opportunities for growth to be humble and not selfish. I pray for every young adult that we would see things as opportunities instead of inconveniences. And I pray for every parent that you would open our eyes to see the children around us who need us in their lives and give us an open heart to minister to them. Because Jesus, at the end of the day, we're not asking anything from you. We just want to become more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.